In the harsh winter of 1610, a powerful Hungarian nobleman named Georgi Thurzo arrived at Cactus Castle with his armed men. They had traveled through frozen roads, prepared for the bitter cold, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited inside. A terrible odor filled the air, mixing with smoke with something metallic and wrong. Deep within the castle dungeons, the darkest village rumors became horrifying reality. They discovered a young girl, chained and alive, but her vacant eyes revealed a mind already broken by unspeakable terror. Then another victim was found. Finally, they entered a chamber where the source of that dreadful smell lay, a lifeless young woman on a table, her pale skin marked with countless puncture wounds, as though every drop of vitality had been drained away. The architect of these horrors wasn't hiding in shadows. She sat in her dining hall, radiating cold aristocratic superiority. This was Countess Elizabeth Báthory, niece of a king and member of the legendary Bathory clan. Her family's dark reputation in Transylvania rivaled only that of Vlad the Impaler, the historical figure who inspired Dracula legends. When confronted with the discoveries below, she displayed no remorse, only icy fury at the audacity of men invading her domain. This raises a chilling question: how does a woman of such intelligence and refinement transform into the monster accused of these crimes? Tonight, we trace the origins of the Blood Countess across centuries, from Transylvanian legends to an isolated Hungarian castle, from the trial that shocked a kingdom to the vampire tales that haunt our culture today. This isn't merely the story of a monster, but of absolute power, human vanity, our darkest shadows, and the beast within the queen. To understand that beast, we must first examine the gilded prison that shaped her. Before becoming the Blood Countess, she was a child prodigy, a lonely queen trapped by her own power. To solve the mystery of what she became, we must journey back to meet the brilliant, frightening girl she once was. The name given at birth carries weight. Hers was Bathory. In 16th century Hungary, this name represented both promise and threat. It meant power. The Bathory family ranked among the kingdom's oldest and most influential dynasties. They weren't simply wealthy merchants possessed gold, but the Bathorys controlled land. Massive estates stretched for miles, covered in dense forests, flowing rivers, and countless villages where people lived and perished under their rule. They constructed imposing stone fortresses as symbols of strength and led armies into battle. For generations, the Bathory name signified victory and inspired fear. They were Transylvanian princes, rulers of a wild, beautiful land of ancient mountains and deep shadows, a place of legend. The people whispered that the Bathorys were different from other nobles, that they were wolf-blooded, meaning they were proud, fierce, and sometimes possessed a wildness that couldn't be tamed. The family was known for duality. On one side, brilliance, cleverness, bravery, natural leadership. On the other, darkness, a history of violent tempers, strange moods, and cruelty that seemed to flow through their bloodline like poison. This family produced both heroes and tyrants. Elizabeth's own uncle exemplified their power. His name was Stephen Bathory, not merely a prince or lord, but King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, one of Europe's most respected and powerful rulers. This was the family into which Elizabeth was born. She wasn't just another noble girl. She was a Bathory, a king's niece. From birth, the world expected greatness, power, and brilliance from her, and it wouldn't be disappointed. But the world didn't know about the family's darker aspect, the shadow that came with wolf blood. And in Elizabeth, that darkness would find its perfect vessel. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by silk and stone. From her earliest days, she stood apart from other children. A genuine prodigy, at a time when many powerful noblemen could barely write their names, young Elizabeth mastered languages, becoming fluent in Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. Her mind was sharp and brilliant as a cut diamond. She was raised in pure luxury, wearing dresses of finest fabrics, adorned with jewels that sparkled in candlelight, attended by servants ready to fulfill her every wish. She lived inside a beautiful painting. But even the loveliest painting can be a prison. Her childhood lacked warmth and simple games. It was a time of training. She wasn't just a girl but a political asset, a valuable piece belonging to the great Bathory family. Her education wasn't merely reading and writing. It was about power, learning to command servants, speak to influential men, and conceal true feelings behind a mask of cold noble pride. Though surrounded by people daily, she was deeply, profoundly alone. Something else separated her further from the world. From a young age, Elizabeth suffered from mysterious illness. Without warning, violent seizures would overtake her body. She would collapse, shaking, her mind lost in turmoil. In the superstitious 16th century, people had dark explanations. They whispered that a demon possessed the girl, darkness living inside her perfect noble body. Perhaps it wasn't demonic work. Perhaps it was something more tragic, her mind simply too powerful for a young girl's body, a mind that felt everything so intensely it would sometimes break under pressure. These episodes were the first cracks in her gilded cage, signs that inside the perfect princess existed a deep, troubled world no one could see, a world that would one day burst forth and consume everything in darkness. In the world of power, a daughter's hand in marriage is among a family's most valuable assets. It isn't given for love but as a piece in a grand political game, a way to unite powerful families and create unstoppable alliances. For someone as important as Elizabeth Báthory, her marriage was arranged almost from infancy. At just 10 years old, a child playing in cold castle halls, she was promised. The man was Ferenc Nadasdy, son of another of Hungary's most powerful families. Joining the Bathorys and Nadasdys would create a force capable of shaping the kingdom's future. At age 15, the arrangement was sealed. Elizabeth became his wife. But Ferenc Nadasdy was no ordinary husband. He was a living legend, known across the land as the Black Knight of Hungary. He wasn't a prince sitting comfortably but a soldier whose true home was the battlefield. His entire existence was dedicated to one brutal purpose, fighting the Ottoman Empire's armies constantly attempting to invade from the south. He was Hungary's shield, terrifyingly effective at his job. He was a brilliant commander but also known for extreme brutality. In war, he was merciless, showing enemies no pity, his victories always soaked in blood. In the violent 16th century, this wasn't seen as weakness. His battlefield cruelty was viewed as strength. He was respected, celebrated, a national hero. This was the man Elizabeth married, a man whose life was violence, whose greatness was measured by enemy deaths. He was a celebrated hero who was almost never home. Right after their grand wedding, a celebration of power more than love, the Black Knight returned where he belonged, the battlefield. He left his young, brilliant wife behind to wait in his vast empty castle. He had given her his name, wealth, and power, but also his absence. While he fought great southern armies for years at a time, his teenage wife was left in charge of everything. Elizabeth didn't just wait. She ruled. She became absolute master of the Nadasdy family's vast lands, boss of thousands, in charge of farms, villages, and protective stone castles. She collected taxes, paid soldiers, ensured adequate food supplies. Those working for her quickly learned their new lady was no weak girl. She was intelligent, efficient, and extremely strict, demanding perfect obedience, unafraid to punish failure. During the day, the castle was her kingdom, a busy world of activity, servants, soldiers, and officials waiting for her decisions. She was a queen on her throne, her power real. But at night, noise faded. Servants went to bed, fires burned low, the castle became quiet. In long dark hours, her kingdom became her prison. She would walk vast empty halls, footsteps echoing in silence. She had power over thousands but no one to talk to, wealth beyond imagination but no friends. She was the lonely queen of a silent castle. Her only connection to her husband, proof he was still alive, would arrive by horse. A tired messenger would bring letters from distant battlefields. But these weren't love letters filled with tender words. They were war reports, paper smelling of smoke and steel, sometimes stained with mud and blood, telling stories of battles won, enemies killed, the brutal business of war. In those long lonely years, she learned that power was a tool for maintaining order, that fear was the best way to ensure obedience, and that in her cold, empty world, the only reliable things were her own strength and will. She was learning to rule. She was learning to be alone. The lands Elizabeth controlled were enormous. Villages were far apart, separated by thick forests and winding roads. News traveled slowly. In this isolated world, Elizabeth knew her power was the only thing holding everything together. Her husband was a ghost, a name whispered by soldiers. She was the reality, the one they saw daily. She believed their respect for her was the only barrier between order and chaos. One day, a servant girl was caught stealing, perhaps a piece of bread or a silver button, something small. The girl was young, probably hungry or foolish. In another household, she might have been scolded or docked pay. But this wasn't another home. This was Elizabeth Báthory's kingdom. Elizabeth didn't see a hungry girl. She saw a crack in the wall. From her perspective, the theft wasn't about the stolen object but a challenge, a test of authority. If one servant could break rules without punishment, others would try. Soon whispers would start in villages saying the Countess was soft, her absent husband's replacement was weak, and weakness was a disease that could spread like plague through her lands. She knew she had to eliminate it before it could grow. So she decided to make an example. The girl was brought to the castle courtyard center for all other servants to witness. She ordered guards to punish the girl, not quickly or quietly, but slowly, publicly, and brutally. Other servants were forced to watch. They saw the girl's tears, heard her cries, and understood Elizabeth's message, a message written in pain saying, "I make the rules here, there is no one above me, and this is what happens when you forget." This act of cold, calculated cruelty was a turning point, not yet the work of a monster who killed for pleasure, but of a lonely queen who believed fear and respect were identical. She was speaking the only language she'd ever truly learned from her family and famous husband, the language of absolute power and necessary pain. It was a lesson she was learning to speak very well, a lesson she would soon begin to enjoy. Then in 1604, news arrived at the castle, not another letter smelling of smoke and steel, but the final message from the battlefield. Ferenc Nadasdy, the great Black Knight of Hungary, the hero who had survived countless battles, was dead, not killed by an enemy's sword but by sudden illness in his war camp. Everything changed. The one man whose power equaled her own was gone, the one person who could perhaps have controlled her was gone. Elizabeth Báthory was now a widow, but not a sad, weak figure in black. She inherited her husband's great wealth and many castles, adding them to her own family's vast power. She became, instantly, wealthier and more powerful than ever before. She was no longer the lonely queen waiting for news from a distant husband. She was the absolute, unquestioned master of her world. For all those years, her husband's life had been like a chain, however long, keeping her connected to the world of men, war, and politics. Now that chain was broken, and a dragon finally freed from its chain is a hungry creature. The question was, what would it feast on? In the first months after her husband's death, Elizabeth did what was expected. She wore black, lived in quiet mourning, and grieved. The loss was real. Ferenc Nadasdy had been more shadow than husband, but he was the great defining shadow of her life, her partner in power, and his death left a void in her world. But for a mind like Elizabeth's, grief doesn't last forever. The sharp pain slowly fades, and in its place something else begins to grow, something quiet and slow and far more dangerous: boredom. For years, her brilliant mind had been occupied. Running huge estates was difficult work requiring all her focus and energy. It was a challenge. Now, after so many years, it was no longer challenging. The work was easy, the problem small. Her mind, a powerful engine built for war and strategy, had nothing to do. It was like a strong, fast horse locked in a tiny stable with nowhere to run. The people around her didn't help. She was the Countess, surrounded by servants, officials, and advisors, but they weren't her equals. They were employees, paid to say yes. They bowed when she entered rooms, told her she was wise and beautiful, never disagreed, never challenged, never said no. She was completely, totally alone at the top of her own small mountain. So the immense energy of her mind, with no great problems to solve, began to turn inward, focusing on smaller, more personal things. She would spend hours staring into a silver mirror, watching her own face, looking for any new line, any sign that time was touching her. In the vast silent halls of her castle, she became obsessed with the one enemy she couldn't command, the one force she couldn't defeat, her own aging. Her powerful mind, with no outlet, began to search for a new project, a new obsession, a new darker kind of science. And in her court's shadows, people were waiting, people who knew her weaknesses, people who wouldn't tell her no but would instead whisper yes, people who would help her build a new kind of kingdom, not of land or wealth, but of secret rituals and pain. A predator of this kind is never truly alone. A queen, even a dark one, needs a court. As Elizabeth's obsession grew, she began gathering a strange loyal group of helpers around her. They weren't her friends but extensions of her will, her hands, her eyes, and the instruments of her cruelty. The first, and perhaps most important, was a woman named Dorco. She was an old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, her mind filled with superstitions and folk magic of the old country. She was the one who whispered ideas into Elizabeth's ear when the Countess worried about a new facial line. Dorco wouldn't offer science or reason but magic. She spoke of ancient secret remedies, folk power passed down from woman to woman for centuries. She presented using blood not as horrifying crime but as lost art, secret power only the strongest women were brave enough to use. Then there was Ilona Jo. Ilona had known Elizabeth since infancy, had been her wet nurse, the woman who fed, held, and cared for her when her own mother was busy with politics. In Ilona's heart, the powerful Countess was still that little child, and her love for that child was blind, absolute loyalty. She would do anything to please her mistress, anything to soothe her worries. If the Countess needed a special herb, Ilona would find it. If she needed a secret kept, Ilona would take it to her grave. Her love was so complete it twisted into powerful poison. She became an enabler, the loving mother figure who would help her child do terrible things. Every court needs a soldier. Elizabeth had Janos Ujeri, a man they called Fixco. He wasn't smart or a thinker. He was a man of great physical strength and simple dog-like loyalty. When the Countess gave an order, he didn't ask why, didn't think about right or wrong. He simply obeyed. He was the muscle, the brute force needed when a task required a strong arm and a quiet mouth. Finally, there was Katerina Banica. She was the housekeeper at another of Elizabeth's castles, the most practical member of this dark circle, the organizer. While Dorco dreamed of magic and Ilona offered comfort, Katerina managed details. She knew which local families were poorest, which parents were most desperate to give daughters a better life, and which girls, if they disappeared from the world, wouldn't be missed. This was the coven, the old mystic, the loving nurse, the loyal brute, and the clever housekeeper. They gathered around their lonely queen, bound together by her power and by dark secrets they were beginning to share. The stage was now set, the actors in place, and the first act of horror was about to begin. Elizabeth Báthory had defeated every enemy she'd ever faced. She controlled her lands, her people, her future. But there was one enemy she couldn't command, an enemy that lived inside her own castle, watched her every day, and told her a truth she didn't want to hear. That enemy was her mirror. In her private chambers, late at night when the castle was silent, Elizabeth would sit before a large mirror of polished silver. For years, the mirror had shown her a queen's face, pale perfect skin, dark intelligent eyes, and a mouth set in a line of confident power. It was a Bathory face, the face of youth. But now in her mid-40s, the mirror was beginning to betray her. It showed a tiny fine line near her eye corner, a line that hadn't been there last year. It showed the faint shadow under her chin where skin was no longer tight as a drum. These were small things, things another woman might accept as simple natural work of time. But to Elizabeth, they weren't natural. They were an attack. In her world, a noblewoman's beauty was a kind of power, a sign of health, strength, and family's superior blood. For Elizabeth, control was everything. She could control servants, money, castles, but couldn't control time. Aging was a thief breaking into her own body, stealing her youth. It was rebellion happening inside her own skin, and it terrified her. It was the first battle she'd ever fought knowing she would lose. This wasn't just about appearance. This was terrifying loss of control. The face in the mirror was no longer just her own, but a daily reminder that she was mortal, that she was weak, that her power wasn't as absolute as she believed. The reflection became her tyrant, its silent judgment a constant nagging whisper. As she stared into her own eyes, she saw that small lines on her face were like small cracks forming in her soul. The loneliness, the boredom, the cold cruelty she was beginning to practice, it was all there. The decay on the inside was finally starting to show on the outside. Elizabeth Báthory decided she would go to war with time itself. She would do anything, absolutely anything, to win. The war with time was a quiet one, fought inside Elizabeth's own mind in the silence of her chambers. But a war needs a weapon. One afternoon, by complete accident, she found one. The scene was normal. Elizabeth was sitting before her mirror and a young servant girl was combing her long dark hair. Perhaps the girl was tired or nervous, her hands trembling as she worked on the powerful countess's hair. She made a small mistake. The comb caught in a knot and she pulled just a little too hard. A sharp sting of pain shot through Elizabeth's scalp. In an instant, all the boredom, all the frustration, all the silent rage she felt at her own aging exploded. She didn't scold the girl or warn her. She reacted with striking snake speed. She turned and struck the girl across the face. It wasn't a simple slap but a blow of pure unrestrained fury. The force sent the girl stumbling backward, a cry of pain and shock on her lips. A few drops of the servant girl's blood flew through the air and landed on the countess's hand. Elizabeth looked down at the small red beads on her pale skin. She was annoyed. She grabbed a silk cloth to wipe the blood away, but as she cleaned her skin, she paused. Her eyes narrowed. She stared at the spot where the blood had been. The skin underneath seemed different, looked smoother, the color seemed brighter, more alive. Small faint lines seemed to have vanished. Was it real, or did she simply want to see it so badly that her mind made it real? It didn't matter. In that moment, a new terrible idea was planted, an idea connecting her fading youth to the blood of the young, an idea whispering that another's pain could be the secret to her own preservation. She looked from her own smooth hand to the crying, bleeding face of the young servant girl. For the first time, she didn't just see a clumsy servant. She saw a solution. She saw a harvest. The countess stood frozen, staring at her own hand, her mind racing with this new terrible possibility. She wasn't the only one in the room. Watching from the shadows was the old woman, Dorco. Dorco had served the Bathory family her entire life. She understood their pride and knew her mistress's great fear of growing old. She saw the look in Elizabeth's eyes. It wasn't guilt for having struck the girl but a look of discovery, and Dorco, woman of old ways and dark secrets, seized her opportunity. She moved to the countess's side, her voice a low raspy whisper no one else could hear. "Blood, my lady," she breathed, her eyes glinting in firelight. "It is the oldest magic, the blood of a healthy young girl, like morning dew for the skin. It holds life. It can make old things new again." With those words, the terrible thought in Elizabeth's mind became a plan. The madness now had purpose. It was no longer just about anger or punishment. It would be a science, a ritual. This is how it began, not with a great bath of blood but with small secret acts of cruelty. A servant girl would make a mistake, drop a silver plate or be too slow with an order. Her mistake would be the excuse. She would be taken to a private room away from others. Ilona Jo, the loyal nurse, would be there to calm her, telling her everything would be all right. And Fixco, the strong silent servant, would be there to hold her down. The punishments were no longer just beatings. Now they would collect the blood, just a small amount in a silver bowl. Later that night in her chambers, the countess would perform her new beauty ritual. She would use the blood as a lotion, rubbing it onto her face and hands, staring into her mirror, believing with all her heart that she was fighting a war against time and that this terrible magic was helping her win. Each time, her helpers would tell her it was working. "You look younger today, my lady," they would whisper, and she would believe them. It was a perfect system of madness, delusion, and cruelty, all happening within the locked rooms of the lonely castle. For a time, this was the system, a secret horrifying routine for beauty, a grotesque treatment happening in hidden firelit chambers. The victims were always girls who already worked for her, girls trapped inside castle walls, their cries for help swallowed by thick stone. It was contained horror, a secret kept by the Countess and her small loyal coven. But the results were never enough. The mirror was a cruel master, always demanding more. The small amounts of blood weren't working the magic she wanted. She needed more. She needed a stronger supply. The dragon's hunger was growing. Soon the girls already inside the castle weren't enough. Her obsession had become too big to be fed by just the servants in her home. It needed to look beyond castle walls, needed to look toward villages filled with healthy young women, their lives untouched by the darkness living on the hill. The need could no longer be contained. The hunt was about to begin. The story we've told so far has been about one powerful woman's mind, a journey into her private world of pride and fear. But now our story must change. We must leave the dark secret rooms of the castle, must travel down the winding path from the hill to small villages that huddle in the valley below. Because the true story of horror is never just about the monster. It's about the innocent people the monster destroys. This part of our story is difficult to hear, but for the victims who had no voice, their story must be told. So let us forget the Countess and her castle for a moment. Let us instead meet a girl named Anna. Anna didn't live in a world of silk and silver. Her world was made of wood and mud and hard work. She lived with her family in a small hut with dirt floor and roof made of straw. Her life wasn't easy. From sunrise, her day was filled with chores. She would help her mother tend their small garden, fetch water from the village well, and watch over her younger brother as he played. Her hands were rough from work, not soft from expensive lotions. Her clothes were simple and patched, not made of velvet. Her life was small, but it was hers, filled with simple hopes. Anna didn't dream of becoming a queen. She dreamed of a new pair of shoes for winter, shoes without holes. She dreamed of a harvest so good her family would have a full pot of stew on the fire every night. Perhaps on quiet evenings she dreamed of meeting a kind boy from the next village, of falling in love, of having a small family of her own one day. Her world was warm sun on her face in summer, the smell of baking bread from her mother's oven, and the sound of her brother's laughter. She was a good daughter, a good sister, a good friend. She was a normal girl living a normal life. And high above her small village, on the hill that touched the clouds, the woman in the castle was looking for a new harvest. And Anna, in her innocence, had no idea the monster was about to come looking for her. One day, a visitor arrived in Anna's village. This was unusual. Strangers rarely came to such a small, poor place. The visitor was a woman, unlike the village people. She was well dressed, her clothes were clean, and she spoke with the confident voice of someone who had never known hunger. This was Katerina, the housekeeper from the Countess's court. She didn't come looking like a monster but like a savior. She gathered the village families and spoke to them with a kind smile. She told them that the great noble Countess Bathory was looking for strong, bright, honest young women to work as servants in her magnificent castle. She spoke of a life that was like a fairy tale to these poor people, a life with warm rooms, good food to eat every single day, and beautiful clothes to wear. She said the Countess would pay well. A girl who worked at the castle could send money home to her family, money that could fix a leaking roof, buy medicine for a sick parent, or put food on the table during long, hard winter. For the poor families of the village, this wasn't just a job offer. It was a miracle, a ray of sunlight in a life of endless gray struggle. Anna's parents listened, their hearts filled with a mix of hope and fear. They looked at their daughter, Anna, so full of life and strength. They looked at their own hard hands, their simple hut. They wanted more for her, wanted her to have a life better than their own. How could they say no to this incredible opportunity? How could they stand in the way of her one chance to escape a life of hardship? And so, with tears in their eyes and heavy hearts, they agreed. Anna was overjoyed. She promised her parents she would work hard, make them proud, send them money. She hugged her little brother goodbye and told him to be a good boy. She packed her few small things. With a hopeful smile on her face, she walked away from her village, following the well-dressed woman from the castle. As she walked, she looked up at the great stone fortress on the hill. It looked like a palace in the sky. She believed she was walking toward her new life. She didn't know she was walking toward her end. The journey to the castle was the most exciting trip of Anna's young life. As she got closer, the stone fortress on the hill grew larger and larger until it filled the entire sky. It was bigger than her whole village put together. Its towers seemed to scratch the clouds, and great flags with the Countess's family symbol snapped and waved in the cold wind. She felt a thrill of awe and a little bit of fear. She, a simple village girl, was going to live here. The housekeeper led her to the massive front gate. With a deep groaning sound of heavy wood and old iron, the gate was pulled open just enough for them to walk through. As soon as they were inside, it was closed again behind them. The gate shut with a loud heavy thud. The sound echoed off the high stone walls. It was a final sound, a sound that said, "You are inside now, you do not leave." In that moment, Anna felt the first cold prickle of real fear. She looked at the housekeeper, the woman who had been so kind and friendly in the village. But the kind smile was gone. The woman's face was now a hard, cold mask. Her eyes were no longer friendly. They were the eyes of a wolf looking at a lamb. A rough hand grabbed Anna's arm. She was pulled along deeper into the castle, but they didn't take her to the busy kitchen where other servants would be laughing and working. They didn't take her to the warm, bright rooms where the noble family lived. They led her down a different path, down a long, quiet hallway where the air was cold and still, down a winding set of stone stairs into the shadows. Anna's heart began to beat like a drum against her ribs. This was wrong. This was all wrong. This wasn't the way to a better life. This was the way to a trap. The housekeeper stopped in front of a heavy dark wooden door in a part of the castle that felt old and forgotten. This wasn't a servant's bedroom. This was a prison cell. As the iron key turned in the lock, Anna knew she wasn't here to work. She was here to be the harvest. What happened to Anna and to the dozens, perhaps hundreds of girls who followed her through the castle gates is the darkest part of our story. The details come from testimonies of those who survived and from chilling confessions of the Countess's own helpers. This wasn't chaos. It was a system, a routine. For Elizabeth, these girls were no longer people. They were subjects in a series of terrible private experiments. In her twisted mind, she was a kind of scientist, and her laboratory was the dungeon. She was testing different ways to cause pain, trying to find the most efficient method to harvest life force from her victims. She would watch with chilling focus, as if observing a chemical reaction. Which method produced the most fear? Which produced the most blood? Each act of cruelty was a new test, each scream a piece of data in her monstrous research. One of her methods used the brutal Hungarian winter as its weapon. A girl would be dragged into the castle courtyard in the dead of night, stripped of her clothes, forced to stand in freezing snow. From a high window wrapped in warm furs, the Countess would watch as her helpers poured buckets of icy water over the girl again and again. The sound of water hitting frozen ground would echo in the night. The girl's skin would turn blue, then white. The water would freeze into a thick shell of ice, trapping her. Elizabeth would watch patiently until her subject became a silent living statue, a monument to the killing power of cold. Another experiment used fire. Old iron tongs that had lifted logs into the fire for years were now given a new terrible purpose. They would be heated in the great fireplace until their tips glowed bright angry red. In a dark room lit only by a few candles, the Countess would conduct her test, studying the effects of heat on human skin. Sometimes, for a smaller, more intimate kind of pain, she would simply use burning candles themselves, the smell of melting wax mingling with the scent of terror. Sometimes the experiment was about hunger, a test of mind as much as body. Girls would be locked away in darkness, given no food for days, sometimes weeks. They were left to waste away, listening to sounds of the living castle just outside their door, smelling food from the kitchens, driven mad by hunger that would never be satisfied. In her darkest moments of rage, her scientific curiosity would disappear and the wolf blood of her family would take over. Testimonies claim she would fall upon a victim like a wild animal, biting chunks of flesh from their arms, shoulders, and faces. But the most famous story, the legend that turned the Countess into a timeless nightmare, was the tale of the Iron Maiden. The legend says this was her masterpiece of pain, a tall metal case built in the shape of a beautiful woman. On the outside, it was a work of art. On the inside, it was a machine lined with dozens of sharp silver spikes. A girl would be forced inside. The doors would be slowly closed. As the spikes slid into her body, her blood would pour down, collected in a small basin at the bottom. Most historians today believe this terrible machine wasn't real. But the story itself tells the truth. The horror in that castle was so great, so creative, so thoughtfully evil that people needed a legend just as monstrous to describe it. They needed a symbol for cruelty so perfect it could only come from the mind of a queen, a monster now living and hunting in the castle on the hill. But here we must ask a vital question: was this horror truly all for a few drops of blood? Was this elaborate system of pain just a means to an end? The terrible truth hidden in confessions of her helpers is that the magic wasn't working. The blood didn't make her younger. The mirror still told its cruel, honest story every morning. The lines were still there. Time was still winning its war. For a woman like Elizabeth, a woman who had never failed at anything, this failure was a source of deep burning anger. So the mission changed. The goal was no longer the result but the process, the planning, the control, the performance of the ritual itself. This became the new dark art that filled the emptiness of her days. The cruelty was no longer about a cure. It became the cure for her boredom. In those dark locked rooms, Elizabeth Báthory found something that even her vast wealth and power couldn't give her in the outside world. She found a feeling of complete total control. In that room, she was more than a countess. She was a god. She could decide who felt pain, who cried, who begged, who fell into silence. She could decide who lived and who died. It was the ultimate feeling of power, a feeling that made her forget the wrinkles in the mirror, a feeling that made her forget her own fear of death. The girls were no longer subjects in a scientific experiment. They were dolls in her private playhouse, objects for her to break and arrange as she pleased. This is where true sadism was born. The pleasure was no longer in the idea of youth from blood. The pleasure was in the power she felt as she caused the pain. The cruelty was no longer the means to an end. The cruelty was the end. She was no longer a desperate woman trying a magical cure. She was a predator, simply enjoying the hunt. This dark new purpose, this love for the power that pain gave her, gave birth to the most famous part of her story. It's the image that has haunted our nightmares for centuries. It's the legend that transformed the Countess of Cactus into the Blood Countess. It's the story of the Bath of Blood. Picture a room hidden deep within the castle where no outsider has ever set foot, a private bathhouse built of dark stone. The air is thick and heavy, warm with steam from heated water and sweet with smell of expensive oils and perfumes, a beautiful cloying scent designed to cover up another much sharper smell that clings to the walls. In the room's center, sunk into the floor, is a large pool made of white marble, a work of art. But tonight, the marble is stained deep brilliant crimson. The pool isn't filled with water. It's filled with freshly drawn blood of her victims. The Countess enters. Her helpers, her coven, follow her like silent ghosts, their faces lit by flickering candlelight. They don't speak. This is a holy moment in their dark religion. Elizabeth lets her silken robes fall to the floor. She's no longer just a countess. In this secret room, she's a goddess preparing for her most sacred ritual. She steps down into the pool. She feels the unnatural warmth on her skin. She closes her eyes and leans her head back. She doesn't feel the horror of what she's doing. She feels only a strange, powerful peace. In her mind, this isn't the blood of the dead. It's the very essence of life, a magical fountain of youth, and she's its only believer. She believes that with every moment she spends in this terrible bath, her skin is becoming smoother, her body becoming younger, and she's defeating time itself. She's not just washing her body but washing away her own mortality. It's a perfect, horrifying image, and it's almost certainly a lie. The story of the bloodbath was never mentioned in the hundreds of pages of testimony from her trial. Her own servants, who confessed to every other unspeakable act, never spoke of this. It was a legend that appeared in writing much later, a dark flower that grew from the soil of her real crimes. But the legend survives for a reason. It survives because it's a perfect symbol for the truth of her soul. She may not have literally bathed her body in blood, but she wanted to. She wanted to wrap herself in the life she had taken, wanted to wear the youth of her victims like a silken cloak, a shield against the cold truth of her own aging. The bloodbath is a nightmare that shows us the shape of her desire, a desire so monstrous it could only be remembered as a dark, terrible fairy tale. Inside the castle walls, the Countess lived within her dark dream. But outside in the world of the living, the nightmare was becoming real. One missing girl is a tragedy. 2 is a coincidence. But after 3, 4, then 10, then 20 girls disappear from villages surrounding the castle, it's no longer a coincidence. It's a pattern. It's a hunt. The fear began as a quiet whisper, a secret shared between grieving mothers. But soon that fear grew into a sickness that spread through the entire region. Life in the villages changed. Families no longer let their daughters walk alone. A knock on the door from a well-dressed stranger was no longer a sign of opportunity but a sign of terror. The sight of the great castle on the hill, once a symbol of power and protection, now felt like a curse. It was a shadow that loomed over their lives, a place that stole their children. The people were too afraid to say the Countess's name. To speak against her was to invite her attention, and no one wanted that. So they gave the evil on the hill a new name, a name from a dark fairy tale. They called her the Ogress of Cactus, and the whispers were growing louder. They began to reach the ears of people with some authority. A local Lutheran minister, a man named István Magyari, started to hear terrible stories from families in his church. He tried to offer comfort, but he knew this was human evil, not a simple act of fate. Local officials started to notice that the names of too many young women were vanishing from their records. The fear was no longer just the sorrow of poor peasants. It was becoming an open secret, a problem that responsible men knew they couldn't ignore forever. But what could they do? The whispers were growing. The evidence was in the empty chairs at every family's table. But the woman in the castle wasn't just a landowner. She was a Bathory. Her family were princes and kings. Her power felt as high and untouchable as the stone walls of her fortress. To speak an official accusation against her wasn't just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Who would dare to fight the ogress when the ogress was a queen? For years, the Countess was safe. As long as her victims were daughters of poor peasants, their cries were just whispers in the wind. Their lives were cheap and the world of powerful men didn't care. But Elizabeth was growing bolder, growing more desperate. The mirror on her wall was still her greatest enemy. In her twisted, arrogant mind, she found a new reason for her failure. The blood of peasant girls, she decided, was too thick, dirted by hard work and poor food. It wasn't pure enough. She needed the blood of her own kind, the clean, pure, noble blood of aristocratic girls. This was a dangerous new game. But how could she lure daughters of noble families into her castle? She couldn't simply offer them jobs as servants. She needed a more clever, more tempting trap. So she created one. She sent out official letters to all the lesser noble families in the region, families with a proud name but not much money or land. The Countess Bathory announced that she was opening a special academy, a school right inside her own castle. It would be a school for their daughters. We must understand what this offer meant to these families. It was the chance of a lifetime, a golden ticket. In the 16th century, a young noblewoman's only future was a good marriage. A girl taught by the great Countess Bathory herself, niece of the King of Poland, would be the most sought-after bride in the entire kingdom. Elizabeth promised to teach their daughters everything they needed to know: how to dress, how to dance, how to speak to princes and dukes, how to behave at the king's royal court. She wasn't just offering lessons. She was offering to turn their daughters into queens. For an ambitious family, this was a promise impossible to refuse. These noble families lived far away. They didn't hear the fearful whispers of the peasants, and even if they did, they wouldn't have believed them. In their minds, the troubles of the poor had nothing to do with their own safe, protected world. All they saw was the powerful name of Bathory and a golden future for their children. The invitations were sent. The families gratefully accepted. The trap was set. One day, a fine carriage pulled by 4 black horses made its way up the winding road to Countess Castle. It stopped before the great gate. A servant opened the door and a young woman stepped out. She was the daughter of a nobleman, dressed in fine clothes, her face full of hope for the future she'd been promised. She didn't know she was the first of a new, more dangerous harvest. The dragon had feasted on sheep for years. Now it was ready to devour the wolves, and attacking the nobility was a mistake that even she couldn't afford to make. The golden promise of the Countess's Academy was a brilliant trap built on the hopes and ambitions of proud families. But the plan, as clever as it was, had one fatal flaw, a flaw born not of cruelty but of simple communication. When a peasant girl disappeared, she was erased from the world. Her family had no one to write to, no one to complain to. Their sorrow was a quiet, lonely thing. But daughters of the nobility were different. They were part of a larger world. They had parents who expected letters, cousins who attended royal court, uncles who commanded soldiers. They weren't invisible. When they vanished, the silence they left behind was loud. At first, a noble father whose daughter had gone to the academy wouldn't worry. When weeks passed with no letter, he would tell himself she was simply busy with important studies. Perhaps winter roads were bad and the messenger had been delayed. He might send a polite message to the castle and would receive a polite reply from the Countess's staff. The girl was well, they would write, but was feeling slightly ill and being cared for. Or perhaps she was on a private religious retreat and couldn't be disturbed. The excuses were always perfect, believable. But then 2 of these fathers, perhaps old friends who had fought together in wars, might meet at a wedding or court event. They would talk about their families, about their children. One would mention his daughter studying with the great Countess Bathory. The other would say his daughter too was at the academy. They would speak of the strange silence, the lack of letters. They would discover that both their daughters were supposedly ill or on retreat at the exact same time. In that moment, cold fear would replace their trust. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a pattern. The polite inquiries to the castle stopped. They were replaced by worried demands. Then worried demands became angry accusations. These weren't whispers of peasants that could be ignored. These were formal complaints of powerful men, written on expensive paper and sealed with wax of a noble house. A river of these letters began to flow to the great cities of Vienna and Budapest, landing on the desks of the highest officials in the kingdom. For the first time, the name Bathory was being spoken in halls of power, not with respect but with suspicion. The shouts of the nobility were a different kind of noise, a noise that could shake the throne itself. The king could no longer look away. The case of the Ogress of Cactus was finally officially open. The net was beginning to close. The King of Hungary now had a serious problem. The complaints from his noble families were too loud to ignore. He knew he needed to act. But this was a delicate situation. He couldn't send a simple group of soldiers to the castle of a Bathory. To hunt a creature this powerful, you needed a special kind of hunter. The king knew exactly who that hunter was. His name was Georgy Thurzo. Thurzo was the Palatine of Hungary, the second most powerful title in the entire kingdom. The Palatine was the king's right-hand man, a great judge, a powerful general, and when he spoke, it was with the authority of the king himself. He was one of the few men in the country whose power could match Elizabeth's own. In a strange twist of fate, he was also her cousin. He knew the Bathory family. He knew their pride, their power, and their dark reputation. The king called Thurzo to his court and gave him a direct secret order: go to the lands of the Countess Bathory, find out if these terrible rumors are true, and if they are, put an end to it by any means necessary. With that order, the game changed. This wasn't a grieving father or local priest trying to find justice. This was the state itself moving silently and purposefully. Thurzo wasn't a man who could be fooled by a noble name or show of wealth. He was patient, clever, and completely loyal to the king. He was a hunter, and he had just been given his prey. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth Báthory had a real enemy, an enemy with the power, intelligence, and will to tear down her castle walls and drag her secrets out into the light. The hunter was on his way, and the Countess, busy with her dark rituals, had no idea he was coming. Georgi Thurzo was a patient hunter. He knew an accusation against a Bathory needed to be a perfect weapon, sharp and unbreakable. So before he acted, he gathered his proof. He sent his most trusted men disguised as simple travelers into the lands ruled by the Countess. They didn't come to command but to listen. They moved quietly through villages, promising the king's protection to anyone brave enough to speak the truth. Slowly, after years of terrified silence, the stories began to spill out. Thurzo's men wrote everything down, every name, every date, every heartbreaking detail. The pages of investigation began to fill with quiet sorrow of the people. One testimony came from a father, a minor nobleman, his voice heavy with guilt. The Countess promised to make my daughter a true lady. I gave her a small bag of coins for her journey. I watched her carriage ride away. It was the last time I ever saw her. Another came from a young woman who had escaped. She showed investigators small white scars covering her arms and hands. It was a game to her, she whispered. Some days she would call us to her room just to stick us with needles, to see if we would flinch. We learned not to make a sound. A local priest gave a more chilling account. He spoke of nights when he would see the Countess's most trusted servants carrying large heavy baskets into the church graveyard long after midnight. They would dig in unconsecrated ground where no good Christian would be buried. I didn't know what they were burying. They were too small to be adults. I was too afraid to ask. Thurzo read every word. He saw the pattern. The lure was always a promise of a better life. The cruelty was always creative and personal. The end was always a silent, unmarked grave. He collected the names of missing girls, and the list grew longer and longer. Each story was a single stone, but Thurzo was patient. He kept collecting the stones, one horrifying testimony at a time. He now had a mountain of evidence, a mountain so large, so heavy with truth that it would be enough to crush even a Bathory. He had the words of the living, the whispers of the dead, and the authority of the king. He now had the proof he needed. It was time to enter the dragon's lair. While Georgi Thurzo's men moved silently through villages gathering their mountain of proof, inside the high walls of Cactus Castle, a different kind of poison was spreading. It wasn't a poison of body but of mind. It was the poison of fear. The Countess, who had lived her entire life feeling untouchable, began to feel the eyes of the world on her. Her brilliant calculating mind, once focused on her dark rituals, now turned to paranoia. She saw plots everywhere. If two maids whispered together in a hallway, she would see them as conspirators and have them punished for secrets they didn't have. The castle, once her safe fortress where she was absolute god, was beginning to feel like a trap, its walls closing in on her. At night, she would walk the cold stone corridors, a ghost in her own home, listening at doors, certain that everyone, even people she had raised from nothing, was plotting her downfall. Her inner circle, the loyal helpers who had been her partners in cruelty, were beginning to drown in that same fear. They had believed her power was a shield that would protect them forever. Now they understood the terrible truth. They weren't her partners. They were her tools. When hunters finally came for the dragon, they would be the first to be thrown to the wolves. Their unity, forged in secret and blood, began to crumble. The old woman, Dorco, no longer whispered of magic for youth. Now she burned strange foul-smelling herbs in her room, frantically searching her old books for a spell of protection, a way to make them all invisible to the eyes of law. Ilona Jo, the loyal nurse, became a wreck of nerves. Her hands trembled so much that one evening while pouring wine for the Countess, she spilled a few dark red drops on the table. Elizabeth didn't shout. She simply stopped and gave her a long cold silent stare. In that silence, Ilona felt more terror than any threat could deliver. Even Fixco, the loyal brute, grew jumpy. He would sit for hours sharpening his blades, his simple mind only understanding one solution to a threat: violence. The trust that had been built on shared secrets was now being eaten away by shared fear. They began to argue in hushed, terrified voices in dark corners of the kitchen. "We should run," Fixco would whisper, his hand on the hilt of a dagger. "Flee before they come for us." "And go where, you fool?" Dorco would hiss back. "The Countess's name is the only thing protecting us. If we run, we're just common criminals. This has to stop," Ilona would weep quietly. "We've gone too far. We have to beg for the Countess's mercy." But there was no mercy left in the Countess. One night she overheard them. She heard their whispers of fear, of running away, of stopping. She reminded them who was in control. She confronted Fixco alone, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Don't think you can run from me. There's no place on this earth you could hide where my family couldn't find you. Our fates are tied together now. You'll be loyal to me or you'll not be at all." The coven of cruelty was broken. The loyalty that had been bought with power was dissolving into panic. They were turning on each other, pointing daggers in the dark. They were so busy watching each other, they didn't hear the sound of the hunter's footsteps finally arriving at their door. The end came on a cold night just after Christmas in the year 1610. Georgi Thurzo had finished his investigation. He had his mountain of proof. He had the king's authority. It was time to enter the dragon's lair. He arrived at Cactus Castle with 300 armed soldiers. This time they didn't disguise themselves as travelers. This time they didn't knock. The great wooden doors were forced open with the power of 30 men, the sound of splintering would echoing into the night. The soldiers poured into the castle, spreading through halls like a flood. They moved quickly, their orders clear. The castle staff were frozen with shock and fear. There was no resistance. Thurzo and his personal guard went straight to the places witnesses had described. They went down into cold, damp lower levels, and there they found it all. The rumors were no longer rumors. The whispers were no longer whispers. The horror was real. They found the dark hidden cells. They found girls chained and starving, their eyes wide with terror that had long since burned away their tears. They found instruments of torture still stained with blood. In one cold room, they found the pale, lifeless body of the most recent victim, waiting to be disposed of. The hunt for the Countess's inner circle was swift. Dorco was dragged from her room, muttering curses. Ilona Joe was found weeping in a corner. Fixco was taken down by 4 soldiers, his strength no match for the Palatine's army. With the accomplices in chains and survivors being tended to, Thurzo knew the most difficult part was yet to come. He left his men to secure the dungeons and walked back up stone staircases alone, his footsteps echoing in the now silent castle. He had to face the dragon herself. He found her in the great dining hall. The room was warm, lit by the glow of a roaring fire. At the head of a long empty table sat the Countess Elizabeth Báthory. She was dressed in a gown of black velvet, and as he entered, she looked up, her face a mask of cold aristocratic anger. She wasn't afraid. She was insulted. Thurzo stood before her. He didn't need to show her the proof he had collected. The proof was screaming and weeping in the dungeons below them. He simply told her that he was acting on the authority of the king and that her time as unquestioned ruler of Cactus was over. His soldiers waited for the order. They expected him to command them to seize her, to put her in iron chains just like her servants. But Thurzo knew the reality of their world. He looked at the woman before him. She was a monster, but she was also a Bathory. To put a woman of her power on public trial would create a scandal so huge it could damage the entire kingdom. So Thurzo made a decision that shocked his own men. He didn't order her arrest. He looked at the most prolific killer the kingdom had ever known, and he simply sentenced her to house arrest. She was forbidden from ever leaving her castle again. The monster had been found. Her servants were in chains, her secrets unearthed. But the dragon itself was too powerful to be caged like a common criminal. A trial was set for her accomplices. But the world held its breath and asked a terrifying question: how do you punish a killer who is untouchable? And what happens when a creature of such immense rage is cornered with nothing left to lose? The trial began in winter of 1611. The great hall was filled with the most important judges and officials in the kingdom. The air was heavy with weight of terrible secrets about to be told. But as the trial began, everyone noticed the same strange thing: there was an empty space where the most important person should have been. The Countess Elizabeth Báthory wasn't on trial. Her great family name was still a shield protecting her from final shame of public judgment. Instead, the court would put her helpers on trial: her coven, her hands, her teeth. In the room's center stood Ilona Joe, the loyal nurse, Dorco, the old woman of magic, and Fixco, the loyal brute. They were no longer the proud, feared servants of a great countess. They were pale, thin, and broken, their eyes filled with terror of their own coming deaths. Now, to save themselves, they were ready to tell the world everything. One by one, they were brought forward to confess. Each one tried to blame the others. Each one tried to make their own part in the horror seem smaller. Ilona Joe, the nurse, spoke through tears. She told the court she had only acted out of love and fear for her mistress. The countess ordered it all, she cried. She was my lady. I held her when she was a baby. How could I say no? She has a terrible temper. I was afraid she would kill me too. Dorco, the old mystic, tried to claim she was innocent of the worst crimes. She tried to blame others for being too cruel. I only suggested old remedies, simple magic. It was the countess who demanded blood, and the others, they enjoyed the cruelty far too much. Fixco, the simple-minded brute, said he was just a servant following orders. He claimed he wasn't smart enough to plan such things, that he only did what the women told him to do. The countess and Dorco, they planned everything. I was only a tool in their hands. They each told their own story. They each pointed a finger at the others. But every confession, every tear, every desperate excuse told the same horrifying tale. They described the girls, their names, their faces. They described the needles, the beatings, the freezing water, the fire. They painted a picture of a castle that had been turned into a factory of pain. Every story, no matter who was telling it, was like an arrow flying from that courtroom and heading straight toward the silent castle on the hill. They were all describing the same monster, and her name was Elizabeth Báthory. The judges had heard enough. The confessions, filled with hundreds of horrifying details, painted a clear picture of what had happened inside walls of Cactus Castle. The guilt of the 3 servants in the dock was beyond any doubt. The verdict was swift and the sentence was brutal. Justice in the 17th century was harsh and violent, designed to create fear and send a message. For the 2 women, Dorco and Ilona Joe, the court decided on punishment of terrible pain. First, their fingers, the very fingers that had helped their mistress with her tortures, were to be torn from their hands with hot iron pincers. After this, they were to be tied to wooden posts and burned alive in a great fire, so that their bodies and their dark secrets would turn to ash and be scattered by winter wind. For Fixco, the loyal brute, the court decided his part was smaller, so his punishment was quicker but just as final. He was to be taken to a wooden block and beheaded with a single swing of a sword. A few days later, the sentence was carried out. A great crowd gathered to watch the end of this terrible story. They watched as helpers of the Blood Countess paid the price for their crimes. The tools the Countess had used were now broken. The hands that had helped her commit terrible crimes were now gone. The coven of cruelty had been destroyed. But everyone in that crowd, as they watched smoke rise into gray winter sky, was thinking the same thing. The servants were dead, but what about their master? What about the monster herself? The crowd's question hung in cold winter air. What about the Countess? What about the monster herself? The answer would be a frustrating one for those who wanted to see true justice. Elizabeth Báthory would never stand before a judge. She would never be brought before a crowd to answer for her crimes. To understand why, we must remember who she was. She wasn't just a killer. She was a Bathory. Her uncle had been king of Poland. Her family was connected to every other great noble house in the kingdom. To put a woman of her immense power on public trial would have been a monumental scandal. Her crimes were so terrible, so dark that they would bring shame not just on her but on the entire Hungarian nobility. It would make the great families look weak, corrupt, and monstrous in eyes of their own people and in eyes of their enemies. The king and his palatine, Georgi Thurzo, decided that the problem had to be handled quietly. The story and the countess had to be buried. So there was no grand trial for Elizabeth. There was no public confession. The families of the hundreds of girls she had destroyed would never get to look her in the eye and see her judged for what she had done. The queen was too powerful to be tried like a common person. Her crimes were considered too shameful to be spoken of in an open court. But that didn't mean she would go unpunished. Thurzo had planned a different kind of sentence, a punishment that was not about a quick death but about a slow, silent, and complete erasure from the world. The king and his palatine had decided on punishment that was in many ways more terrible than a quick merciful death. A public execution would have been a spectacle, making her a martyr or legend in a single fiery moment. But mercy wasn't the goal. Thurzo, the hunter who had studied his prey so well, designed a punishment not for her body but for her mind. The goal was humiliation. The goal was a slow, silent, complete erasure from the world. They didn't send an executioner to her castle. They sent bricklayers. By order of the king, Elizabeth Báthory was sentenced to be imprisoned within her own home, in a small suite of rooms in the highest tower of Countess Castle. She would be trapped forever inside the very symbol of her power. She likely stood in proud, furious silence as the work began. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would listen to the sounds of her own burial, the wet scraping sound of the trowel, the heavy slap of mortar, the dull solid thud of each brick being laid in place. These were the sounds of her world shrinking one brick at a time. First, they sealed the windows. She would have watched as the view of her lands, the forest she owned, the villages she ruled, was slowly blotted out. The light grew dimmer and dimmer until a final brick was placed and the sun was stolen from her forever. Then they moved to the doors. The sounds of the castle, the voices of servants, the life of the home she commanded, all faded as walls grew thicker. Finally, the last brick was set in place. There was no handle, no key, no lock. There was only a solid wall of stone. In the wall, a single small hole was left, just large enough for a plate of food to be passed through. She was now a ghost in her own house. This punishment was a masterpiece of poetic and terrible justice, for it took from her everything she had ever valued. Think of it. The woman who was obsessed with her own reflection, who stared into her mirror every day fearing the slightest sign of age, was now condemned to live in total darkness. She would never see her own face again. The mirror, her tyrant and her obsession, was now just a useless piece of glass in a black room. The woman who had a god complex, who delighted in ultimate power of deciding who lived and who died, was now utterly powerless. Her entire existence depended on mercy of an anonymous guard's hand pushing bread and water through a hole in the wall. She, who had commanded thousands, could no longer command even a single candle to be lit. The woman whose family name was her greatest source of pride was now a nameless creature in a stone box. Her name Bathory, which had shaken kingdoms, was now a forbidden word. She was alive, but for the rest of the world, she had simply ceased to exist. The woman who had lived in decadent luxury, surrounded by silken clothes and sleeping in soft feather beds, was now left with nothing but a cold stone floor and rags on her back. Perhaps the most fitting justice of all, the woman who had filled her castle with screams of hundreds of victims was now condemned to absolute unending silence. There were no more servants to command, no more girls to torture, no more helpers to conspire with. There was only Elizabeth, alone in the dark with nothing for company but endless echo of her own thoughts and memory of every terrible thing she had ever done. A quick execution would have been an escape. But this wasn't an escape. This was a cage perfectly built for the monster it was meant to hold. She had been erased. So the days turned into nights, and nights turned into years. For nearly 4 years, Elizabeth Báthory lived in her stone tomb. She couldn't see the sun rise or set. The changing of seasons, the green of spring, the warmth of summer, meant nothing to her now. Her world was only darkness and silence, broken just once a day by scraping sound of a plate of food being pushed through the small hole in the wall. This leads us to one final unanswerable question. What does a mind like that do when it's left alone in the dark with nothing but its own memories? Did she feel any regret for what she had done? In the unending silence of her prison, did she finally hear the ghostly echoes of screams that had once filled her castle? Did she see the faces of hundreds of girls she had destroyed? Or did her great Bathory pride refuse to break, even in the end? Did she spend her final years not in sorrow but in a state of pure cold rage? Was she angry at her victims for being weak? At her helpers for confessing? At Thurzo and the king for daring to challenge her? Did she die believing she had done nothing wrong? No one will ever know. Her final thoughts are the one secret she took with her to the grave. In late summer of 1614, a guard came to her cell to deliver her daily meal. He pushed the plate through the small hole in the wall, but he heard no sound from inside. He called out to her, but there was no reply. After waiting for a long time, he called the captain of the guard. They decided to break down the wall. The same masons who had sealed her in were called back to set her free. With hammers and chisels, they broke through stone and mortar, letting light spill into her tomb for the first time in years. They found her lying on the floor. She was cold and still. The great and terrible Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the ogress of Cactus, the Blood Countess of legend, had died just as she had lived for the last 4 years of her life, utterly and completely alone. In the end, the walls of Cactus Castle keep their secrets. Elizabeth Báthory died as she had lived her final years, in silent absolute darkness, a prisoner in her own home. The official records paint a clear picture of a sadistic monster, a woman who used her immense power to commit unspeakable atrocities. Yet whispers of conspiracy never truly faded. Was she framed by powerful men, including her own relatives, who stood to gain her vast fortune? Or was the truth even darker, that her cruelty was so profound it had to be transformed into legend? Over centuries, the historical facts of her case, the missing girls, the torture, the trial, were embellished with tales of bloodbaths and dark magic. The real-life horror of the Countess became a blueprint for fictional horror of the vampire, forever linking her name to the shadow of Dracula. The story of Elizabeth Báthory forces us to confront the terrifying nature of unchecked power and the line where history ends and myth begins. What do you believe happened inside that castle? Was she history's most savage female killer or its most slandered woman?